Airborne divisions were considered the most combat-ready, and they were usually included in the offensive groupings of troops, although of course there was little left of the former paratroopers, who were really better trained than the infantry troops, especially in the regiments, except, perhaps, in our artillery regiment. We are moving towards Kirovograd. Our battery, as well as other gun batteries of the regiment, were transferred to horse traction. Of course, there is a lot of mess with horses. They have to be regularly fed, forged, treated, cleaned, etc. But on the other hand, on the battlefield they are more maneuverable than cars. Try to take the gun out on a vehicle at direct aim when the enemy is a few hundred meters away. The enemy will certainly detect you and shoot you while you are getting ready to fire. In addition, in the conditions of Ukraine, where there are very few paved roads, off-roading was commonplace. In such conditions it was often simply impossible to move across the field, following the infantry, if vehicles, even such as American Studebakers, which we had before, were used as traction. So we decided to transfer cannon batteries to horse traction, and howitzer batteries, where the gun is much heavier than the cannon, were left on mechanical traction. On January 15th, 1944, we arrived in the designated area and took up the combat order. It was thawing, sometimes raining in the afternoon. Thick fog had been hanging for several days. From our observation point in 5 meters nothing can be seen. It is almost impossible to conduct reconnaissance of the enemy. We are operating in the area of Krasnosilki village, but it is not visible in the fog. The beginning of the offensive is scheduled for January 25th. On the morning of the 25th, the fog became even thicker. How to shoot at targets in such a situation? Artillery preparation was carried out blindly, by area, without preliminary shooting, or at least adjusting the firing. Therefore, the artillery preparation was reduced by almost half and lasted no more than 30 minutes. In such an environment, to count on a reliable suppression of enemy defences was naive. The command decided in these conditions to start attacking the enemy positions with penalty battalions. These battalions were manned by those convicted by military tribunals for war crimes. The sentences were replaced by them with a penalty battalion. If the convicted person showed himself in battle by brave actions and was presented for a reward, then instead of a reward he was reduced the measure of punishment or cancelled it altogether. A penalized man was also considered to have redeemed himself if he was wounded on the battlefield. These battalions also included demoted officers who acted as ordinary riflemen. The penalties went forward and disappeared in the fog. Machine gun and rifle shots are heard ahead, muffled by the fog. We are following the penalized men. We have to support their attack with fire, and where to fire artillery if we cannot see the target, so on their own can be hit. The Germans obviously did not expect an attack. Besides, the fog did not allow to see the attackers, as well as the attackers cannot see the object of attack. Apparently, in this case, the effect of surprise and fog played a decisive role. In any case, the enemy's defence, or rather its leading edge, was broken through. The attack had the character of a game of cat and mouse. Here, success depended on who could see and fire faster. With their scouts and communicators, I followed the infantry. The enemy fiercely resists. We run on a clear field, covered with a shallow layer of snow. From the left flank of the German machine gun pinned us to the ground. The fog has already begun to clear and visibility has increased to 200 to 300 meters. We are lying on the wet ground mixed with snow, not a pleasant pleasure. I gave the command short runs to get out of the shelling zone faster. Ahead in the liquid fog we can see the outskirts of the village. Our paratroopers are already fighting for them. Throw for 25 to 30 meters, and with a run-up I fall on the ground, in a shallow tank track, obviously German, as we did not see our tanks. During this time the enemy did not have time to make an aiming turn. But still it is unpleasant to feel yourself on the fly. Bullets click closer and farther away, showering mud and snow. Soon we are already at the nearest house in the vegetable garden behind the fence. Here also lies a chain of our infantry, which is fighting for the village. The fog began to thicken again, and soon everything seemed to sink in milk. In 2 steps nothing can be seen. The infantry advances from house to house. Then in one place or another, there is a fierce firefight. Obviously our soldiers, as they say, nose to nose with the Germans. We try to keep up with the infantry. The difficulty is that we are simultaneously pulling a field cable behind us to communicate with the firing position of the battery. The fog makes it very difficult for our infantry, and we can't do any aiming fire with our guns at all. There were many tragic cases in the fog. One of the battery commanders of our regiment by car together with the control platoon came in the fog right to the firing position of the enemy battery. The enemy managed to pelt the car with grenades, and almost everyone died before they could open fire. We moved together with the infantry along the azimuth. At times there are clashes with the retreating enemy. In the afternoon the fog cleared a little. We are approaching the village Ositnyashka. It is a rather large settlement, spread out in a gully where a small river flows. In the centre of the village, on an elevated place, stands a tall church. The village has already been bombed by our aviation, and now the enemy is bombing. Approaching the village, we go down a rather steep slope. Here have already passed the tanks of the 5th Tank Army, which was recently put into battle, and went forward with the task of the fastest encirclement of the German grouping. We pass by a tank, turned upside-down tracks. From the hatch hangs a dead tanker. This is an English tank Valentine from the 5th Tank Army. Apparently the mechanic driver did not cope with the control when descending and the tank overturned. Did not pass 200 meters, as in the sky appeared German planes, which turn around and go in for bombing, it seems, on the place where we are. There is a small ravine not far ahead, and we run to it as fast as we can to get away from the enemy planes. There are already quite a lot of our soldiers and officers. The enemy pilots, of course, can see everything well, and they are aiming at this ravine. I managed to fall to the ground when the first bomb burst 20 to 25 meters away. I was lifted upwards by the shock wave and shook a lot. I pressed into the ground, mixed with snow. Other bombs are bursting nearby, shrapnel whistling, hot, tight air of explosions, earth with snow, someone wounded screaming, everything mixed up in a wild dance of death. This hell lasts, apparently, for about 10 or 15 minutes, but it seems like an eternity. At last the enemy planes, having dropped bombs, having used up shells and cartridges, fly away. There were groans, wounded, killed, torn to pieces bodies of people, corpses of killed horses, a bloody mess. I and my soldiers were lucky, no one was killed or wounded. My coat on my back is torn to shreds, but my body is not hurt. I was lucky this time. We run away from this terrible place to the village. On one of its outskirts we have to choose a firing position for direct fire of the battery. Our infantry is entrenched here on the outskirts of the village. We received a message that the enemy counterattacked with tanks in the flank of our division and other units advancing in this direction. Soon arrived the guns of the battery, which from the move began to turn around to shoot at the enemy tanks. They are not yet visible in the liquid fog, but the powerful rumble of tank engines can be heard, and the ground trembles. There was no time to dig in. I would have time to strengthen the gun coulters. From the roof of the nearest house, where I and the scouts took an observation post, you can see a fairly large field on which the enemy tanks are moving. Up to them about a kilometre, and our artillerymen do not see them yet, interferes with the ridge, which is about 300 meters away. There is no time to change the position. We have to fire from guns literally at point-blank range. There are a lot of tanks. In the fog and haze is difficult to count. They are attacking exactly in the direction of our battery. And we have only 2 guns. Somewhere on the left opened fire neighbouring battery, so we are not alone. It's more fun when in such a situation there is someone nearby and can help in the fight against the enemy. Enemy tanks started firing. Howling shells fly over our heads and land on the other side of the ravine, behind the village. I turn there and see an artillery division of 152 mm howitzers on tractors deploying there. The enemy has noticed this and is firing in that direction. These guns are used for firing from closed positions, especially since this division is armed with old systems from 1902/10, heavy and clumsy. But the shell weighs more than 30 kilograms, and if it hits a tank, it can tear off its turret. The tanks entered the firing zone of our battery. The guns opened fire. For the enemy it was a surprise our guns are squat. Besides, they took a position on the edge of the vegetable garden, behind the wattle, and the enemy did not find them before the opening of fire. A fierce duel ensued. The front tanks stopped, whether hit or in order to more accurately make shots at the battery. We have both armor-piercing and sub-caliber shells penetrating enemy armor. Lieutenant Poguliev, the commander of the firing platoon, a former aviator who was wounded and joined our artillery, is running near the guns. Obviously, he shows gun commanders or gunners what tank to shoot at. The rumble of the battle is so loud that it is impossible to understand any command by voice. The tanks are about 250 meters away, and more tanks are coming up from behind, maneuvering around the battered ones. Between the tanks there is a passenger car. Obviously the superiors are driving behind the tanks, but when maneuvering it sometimes remains uncovered. As much as I shouted about it to Poguliev. Finally he noticed my gesticulation and soon saw this car. A few shots, and the car went up in smoke, turning upside down on its wheels. The 152 mm Howitzer Division, taking advantage of the fact that the enemy tanks were distracted by the fire of our battery, managed to turn around and soon opened fire on the enemy tanks. Powerful explosions shook the ground in the enemy battle order. Poguliev, a great lover of trophies, with some of the soldiers from one bump in the field to another, and where and crawling makes his way to the hit car. Soon one of our guns was smashed by a direct hit of an enemy shell, and then another one had one wheel and part of the shield torn off by an explosion. There are killed and wounded. Our sanitary instructor Masha, we're running over, we're crawling from gun to gun, gives the wounded first aid, drags them to the nearest house. Still, several enemy tanks are standing motionless against the firing position. There is smoke coming from some of them. It means that shells of our battery got them. To all appearances, the enemy tank attack has smothered. Enemy tanks, survived in this duel, began to pull back and soon disappeared in the smoke of battle. Again we continue the offensive. Our regiments went forward, holding the direction of the village of Tishkovo. On our right, the 5th Guards Cossack Cavalry Corps of General Selivanov entered the battle. In the evening, when it got dark, we approached the village, several houses burning, illuminating the area round. Our infantry lay down on the outskirts. Here we also shortened the cold night. In the morning we move forward again. Heavy fog makes it difficult to advance. You can run into the enemy, and here only hand-to-hand combat will help, however. The Germans do not withstand hand-to-hand combat. Battalion, with which we are advancing, came to a small lake. We stopped. The battalion commander is trying to contact the regiment commander to clarify the task. The soldiers are busy with their work. Some are snacking, some are changing their shoes, filling the discs of their automatic rifles with ammunition. Soon on the left heard the sound of tank engines, whose tanks in the fog cannot see, faintly distinguishable silhouettes of them moving in the same direction as us, about 150 to 200 meters from us. The battalion commander believes that the tanks are ours, and gives the command finish breakfast and prepare to attack. Ahead lie the villages of Zlatopol and Novomirgorod. The battalion commander jokes, "Now we will strike, take the villages and we will be Zlatopol, Novomirgorod." We go forward, following the tanks, which disappeared ahead in the fog. Soon we meet fleeing soldiers of the battalion, who were moving ahead as a combat patrol. They report to the battalion commander that there are German tanks. Obviously we took them for our own. Soon machine gun bursts and tank cannon shots are heard. The battalion commander decides to move back to the village and on its outskirts to take up defences. From anti-tank means in the battalion has only a few pieces of anti-tank grenades, but this is for the most extreme case. We can't help either, both cannons are broken, and there are no new ones yet. There are no more than 100 men left in the battalion. It's practically a company, and the battalion commander doesn't want to take any risks. We withdrew to the outskirts of the village. The infantry is entrenching. I went into the nearest house. There are no owners. Obviously they are hiding somewhere in the cellar, but the house is warm, the stove is heated. Our overcoats were soaked, our shoes too. We were freezing, and the opportunity to dry ourselves was very useful. I gave a task to keep in touch with the battalion commander, who was stationed in one of the houses nearby. I took off my boots with windings, which were soaked through. The thing is that shoes and uniforms were in short supply, and even we, platoon members, were given boots and windings, as well as soldiers. The stove was warm. I put my soaked shirts and wraps to dry, climbed on the stove and soon fell into a deep sleep. I didn't even notice how it happened. Fatigue and sleepless nights made themselves known. I woke up with a jolt, but there was no one in the hut. I looked out of the window into the yard of the neighbouring house and saw German machine gunners sneaking, ducking down. I grabbed my shoelaces, windbreakers, put on barefoot boots and quickly into the yard. Good thing it was on the opposite side of the neighbouring yard. Ducking down, I ran into the vegetable garden. There, at the end of it, bushes and a small river. In the village I heard machine gun bursts from German automatic rifles and some shots from our rifles. What happened, of course, I do not know, because our infantry is entrenched on the outskirts of the village, to which from the house where I was, not less than 300 metres. I ran along the river through the bushes towards the opposite edge of the village. There the terrain rises steeply uphill. A deep ravine is visible. Wagons can be seen somewhere in the yards, horses phlegmatically chewing hay. The wagons are regimental, but there are no soldiers. They must have run away. Strange situations happened quite often at the front. If the offensive was successful, the rear units strove to move forward at all costs, often preventing the front line units to fulfill their task. They clogged the roads with wagons, especially in populated areas. But if the situation became difficult, as it was now, the rear units were the first to rush back, often provoking panic, or the outskirts of the village. Further 200 metres stretches an open field, beyond which begins a ravine. I put on my boots and windbreakers properly. I looked around. I could see neither my own nor Germans. Somewhere in the village tank engines are humming. Sometimes shots from machine guns and rifles are heard. Rather thick haze hides the village. It's getting evening. Judging by the time, I slept on the stove for 4 hours. For the first time in 2 years of the war, one slept on a warm stove. I go down into the ravine. There's not a soul there. What's the matter and where are our men? I went further. Soon the ravine makes a steep bend. I just turned as suddenly I saw a lot of our soldiers and officers. 300 people from different parts gathered here. In the middle I see a colonel with a Mauser in his hand. All the others are lying in a chain along the edges of the ravine, which here ends and passes into a deep hollow. The colonel looks at me and makes a sign for me to approach him. As I approached, he asked me where I was coming from and what the situation was in the village. I reported to him what I had seen and heard. He said that I was lucky 2 hours ago German tanks had suddenly attacked the village. He asked me if I had any weapons, and I said that I had not been issued any. Swearing, he ordered me to lie down in a common chain and try to get weapons. Lying in the chain, I learned from a neighbour that at the top of the ravine, about 200 metres away, German tanks. Obviously, the Germans guess that there are people in the ravine, but they have no infantry, and the tankers do not risk coming here. Soon it gets dark. Colonel and a few more senior officers split everyone into groups of 10 people, point the direction to the village of Pisarevka, which is about 3 kilometres away. Groups one by one, observing camouflage and caution, go in the direction of the village between German tanks. Soon it was our group's turn. Quietly, ducking to the ground, we move forward. To the right and left in the thick evening haze we can see silhouettes of German tanks, up to them not more than 200 metres. Our group goes farther and farther away. Suddenly a flare flashes behind us, and machine gun bursts from the tanks. Obviously the enemy has spotted some group. The head of our group gives a command, and we run across the ploughed field towards the village. Soon its outskirts appeared. Our infantry was already entrenched here. Somewhere there must be batteries of our division. From this outskirts we went forward. Everything ended safely this time too. I soon found the headquarters of our division, and then my battery. We had no guns. Everyone gathered in 2 or 3 houses, resting. I briefly told my Odyssey to the commander and went to rest after such a mess. Korsun-Shevchenkovsky battle entered the main phase. The grouping of enemy troops was surrounded. Now the task was to defeat it, not to allow the Germans to break out of the cauldron. Our 53rd Army acts on the left flank of this battle, forming an external front and holding back the enemy, rushing to the encircled troops in order to unblock them. The enemy has pulled up to this area large forces, including 3 armoured divisions, totalling more than 300 tanks, as well as several infantry divisions. On January 27th, this grouping launched an offensive. The episode I have described and occurred on this day at the cutting edge of the enemy attack. Meanwhile, our 4th Guards Airborne Artillery Regiment with 5 guns and 4 howitzers defended the anti-tank area southwest of the village of Pizarevka. During the day, the regiment repulsed 2 tank attacks of the enemy, hit 2 Tigers, 2 medium tanks, and 2 armoured personnel carriers. In this battle, the commander of the division, Guards Major Dolgov, died a brave death. All the next day in the area of Pizarevka village there was a fierce battle with enemy tanks, which came close to the village but could not break through our defences. At night the tanks that survived in this battle moved back and apparently were transferred to another direction in the hope to break through our defences there. On January 28th, the ring of encirclement closed around the enemy grouping. In the area of Zvenigorodka town, tankers of the 20th Tank Corps of the 5th Tank Army of the 2nd Ukrainian Front and tankers of the Tank Brigade of the 1st Ukrainian Front met. After the war, one had an opportunity to serve for 8 years in the 20th Tank Division, the former 20th Tank Corps, which at that time was stationed in Poland. This division, as the heir to the combat glory of the 20th Tank Corps, was named Zvenigorodskaya, like our 1st Guards Airborne Division. There is fierce fighting along the entire front. Our 53rd Army is on the offensive, trying to push the outer front away from the encircled enemy troops. The enemy is resisting stubbornly, often goes into fierce tank counterattacks, trying by all means to break through to the encircled troops and open the ring of encirclement. In general, for the period from January 23rd to February 3rd, 1944, our division inflicted the following losses to the enemy: killed and wounded more than 1,000 Hitlerites, hit and burned 22 tanks, including 12 Tigers. Our losses: 1,100 paratroopers were killed and wounded. Most of the cannon artillery of the division and regiments was put out of action. Having repelled fierce tank attacks of the enemy, our division, together with other army formations, continues the offensive in the direction of the town of Shpola, with the task to push the front line as far as possible away from the enemy group of troops encircled near the town of Korsun-Shevchenkovsky. Our battery received 2 76 mm's 3 guns, the same as before, took up a firing position near our front line and prepared to repel enemy tank attacks. There were not many infantry. A thin chain of them was located not far from our position. The weather was bad: strong cold wind, wet snow and rain, mud mixed with snow, pudding weights stuck on our feet. There was nowhere to warm up, there was bare steppe all around. The nearest village was at least 3 kilometers away. The trenches were cold, dirty, damp, and constantly covered with snow. My scouts and communicators dug a small dugout, but there is nothing to cover it with. The nearest forest is at least 1.5 kilometers away. To pass even 100 meters is worth a lot of work because of the mud. We covered it with what we had: to some branches, corn stalks, straw. There is no stove. We dug a niche and a chimney in the side wall, burning straw and corn stalks. There is a dugout full of smoke, but unfortunately not much heat. We have to bear it, there is no better. At night we sleep in a huddle, closely pressed against each other. One day the chief of the financial part of the regiment came to our position. He gave out salaries and at the same time collected membership party dues. I gave my party card to the chief to make a record of the payment. At that moment they shouted outside tanks. I was acting as a commander of a firing platoon. I gave the command battery to battle. The crews rushed to the guns. Another tank attack of the enemy. This time they attacked a neighbouring regiment, and from our position was far away, but the division commander by telephone ordered our battery to open fire on them. The tanks were about 3 kilometers away, and they were moving in such a way that they were turned to our right side, but the distance was great, and it was useless to fire armour-piercing shells. I give the command to fire fragmentation grenades with the fuse set to fugitive action. We were allowed to use 10 shells. We open fire. The shells burst between the tanks. A direct hit in the tank at such a distance a matter of chance. The tanks slowed down. Soon the Germans discovered our position. Several shells fell in the area of our position. One of them hit our dugout, where before sat Notchvin. When the shooting started, he quickly ran back from where he had come. I had forgotten that his party card was left with him when I paid my dues. In the morning I remembered about the party card, found the Nukshvin in the rear of the regiment, but he defiantly declared that he did not have my party card and did not know where it was. I came to the position, with the help of soldiers, dug out the dugout covered with snow and mud, but I did not find the party card, and soon a command followed, and we changed the position. It was an unpleasant incident at that time, although I am still sure that the party card remained with the chief. In those days there were many such over-vigilant people. Sitting in the rear, one had to distinguish oneself somehow. In any case, the party card was missing, which I reported to the division deputy commander. We still hold the external front. The enemy in one place or another is trying to break through our defences to save their encircled troops. Our battery is on direct fire near the leading edge of our defences. I am relieved of my duties as firing platoon commander, and with my scouts and liaison officers occupy an observation post at the edge of the cemetery, in the cemetery ditch. Dug there trench cells, set up observation devices, scouts take turns on duty, observing the enemy. Here also dug a small dug-in, covered it with half-rotten cemetery crosses, rods and straw. A large straw pile was nearby. The weather was still bad, wet snow and rain during the day, and freezing at night. By night so many people crowded into the dugout that we could lie only sideways, pressed tightly against each other, but it was warmer. We slept, of course, clothed with a gas mask under our heads, with an automatic rifle or a carbine, whoever was armed with what. The weather had completely deteriorated, strong wind with snow, a real blizzard with howling. Not far from the dugout there was a telegraph pole with wires, the wind rumbled in the wires, bullets whistled and mines burst the usual front music. Now and then in one place and then in another place there is fierce firing from machine guns, rifles, guns and mortars. It is the enemy under the cover of night and blizzard, trying to break out of the encirclement. Having run into our positions and having received a repulse, he leaves and tries to break through in another place. Our direction is quiet so far. We are napping in a dugout. Suddenly, through the howling wind in the wires there is an unfamiliar melody of a song, and a muffled voice of Mark Burns singing the song Dark Night. It was our radio operator who happened to catch the Moscow wave. The lyrics of the song, which I give here, coincided so much with what was around us at that moment that it seemed to us that the singer was here somewhere near us, that he was singing about us. As we listened to the song, we excitedly exchanged the impression that it accurately reflected what was happening around us. For a long time, the singer's voice and individual phrases that we had memorized sounded in our ears. This song was forever etched in my memory. And it didn't matter that I was unmarried and didn't have, of course, a crib with a baby somewhere. Dark Night. Lyrics by V. Agatov. Music by N. Bogoslovsky. Dark night, only bullets whistle across the steppe. Only the wind rumbles in the wires, the stars twinkle dimly. On a dark night, my love, I know you're awake. And by your crib you secretly wipe away a tear. How I love the depth of your tender eyes. How I want to press my lips to them. The dark night separates us, my love, and a troubled black steppe lies between us. I have faith in you, my dear friend. This faith has kept me from a bullet in the dark night. I'm happy, I'm calm in the battle of death. I know you'll meet me with love, no matter what happens to me. Death is not scary. We've met it many times in the steppe, and now it's circling over me. You're waiting for me and you're not sleeping at the crib. That's why I know nothing will happen to me. The song fell silent, and for a long time we marvelled at the talent of the poet who had guessed exactly what was happening to us, at the talent of the composer and the singer who had created heartfelt, warm music. Gradually the raptures subsided, the night was taking its toll, and we fell asleep again. I woke up, unable to breathe, short of air. It turned out that we were completely snowed in our den in the cemetery. We shoveled a hole in the snow and it became easier. I assigned duty and turned to periodically break through the hole. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, the ceiling of our dugout crackled, and we heard the squeak of the wheels of a brigade. We amicably raised our legs up, pressing them against the ceiling. At the same time, a friendly, strong soldier's mat reacted to this event. Obviously, someone had come at night to get straw. It was dangerous to appear here during the day because of the rifle and machine gun fire. Soon there was an explosion, horse stomping, and everything went quiet. Only in the morning, when I got out, I saw a part of a broken wagon and a snow-filled crater from the explosion. Later we learned that at night the foreman of our division, an elderly man, had come for straw. When he heard some voices from under the ground in the cemetery at night, he was frightened, probably thought that it was from the other side of the world, drove the horses, and when turning the rear wheel hit the mine. The wagon was smashed, he was stunned, the horses ran back in fright with the rest of the wagon, and the foreman was so caught on the reins that the horses dragged him back to where he had left earlier. Then I was told that the foreman was sent to a medical unit. He could not tell me what had happened. He was so frightened by what had happened. The blizzard lasted for several days. Everything was white all around, a continuous white snow veil. Visibility was no more than 10 to 15 meters. The infantry, 2 or 3 men in cells buried in straw. Everything was covered with snow, and it was impossible to see where the front edge of our defense was. On the night of February 17th, 1944, Hitlerites, having lost hope for help to the encircled troops, having abandoned all the equipment, under the cover of darkness and blizzard, a huge column moved to the breakthrough towards the front, to the rear of our troops holding the outer front. The German soldiers were allowed to drink the rest of the vodka, to eat the inviolable stock of food, and the drunken column moved along the gully from the villages of Shenderovka and Kalek to the front, hoping to break out of the encirclement ring. In the middle of the night, Hitlerites suddenly came to the firing positions of the artillery division. Courageous artillerymen fought to the end with the drunken avalanche of the enemy, shooting the attacking chains with direct fire. Soon the Katyusha division came to the rescue. From close-range, artillerymen and guards mortarmen shot the furious enemy infantry at point-blank range. The battle was fleeting and fierce. Drunken Hitlerites were rushing forward, not counting losses. Ahead of the enemy column were several tanks. Behind them moved an avalanche of infantry and all those who were surrounded. The forces were unequal. On a small section of the front, the enemy created a multiple superiority, expecting to break through our defense and get out of the encirclement. The resistance of the Soviet troops in this section of the defense was broken, and the enemy rushed to the outer ring of encirclement. The situation was critical. To hold such a force liquid chain of our defense was almost impossible. All roads were covered with deep snowdrifts, and it was practically impossible to maneuver the reserve to the breakthrough area. The situation was saved by our tankers. Raised at night on alarm, they managed to move to the area of the breakthrough of the enemy column and crashed into it, shooting Hitlerites from tank machine guns, crushing the enemy with tracks. Till the very morning, the cruel fight continued. The enemy column was crushed. Hundreds of corpses, mixed with snow, covered the ground. Thousands of soldiers and officers were taken prisoner, and only small scattered groups managed to hide in the shroud of snow and get out of the encirclement. Among the dead was found, and the commander of the German group, General Stemmermann, who rejected the earlier ultimatum given to him by our command to surrender the entire group. It was the second Stalingrad, only on the Dnieper, and with sadder consequences for the German soldiers. There in Stalingrad, most of the German soldiers and officers, together with the commander, Field Marshal Paulus, surrendered. Here in Ukraine they refused to surrender, and most of them were destroyed. A huge amount of equipment was left on the battlefields. Only according to official data in the period from February 5th to February 18th here were destroyed 430 airplanes, 155 tanks, 376 cannons and mortars, 269 self-propelled guns, more than 900 machine guns. In addition, after the defeat of the enemy grouping on the battlefields was collected a large amount of serviceable equipment: aircraft 41, tanks 116, guns of different caliber 618, self-propelled guns 61, vehicles about 1,000, and a lot of other equipment. 18,200 Hitlerites were taken prisoner, and in total there were about 80,000 people in the encirclement. It turns out that about 62,000 people were destroyed in these battles. How many of our soldiers and officers were killed is unknown. I have not met such a figure anywhere. After the defeat of the encircled group of the enemy, our division occupied the defence in the area of the town of Spola. One day I was called from the front line to the regimental headquarters, where I received the task to get at the disposal of the chief of the rear of the division and perform tasks on his instructions. After arrival to the chief of rear of the division, I was appointed chief of the transportation column for ammunition delivery. The thing is that by that time the roads were so muddy that it was very difficult to move even on foot. I remember once I was crossing a street in the town of Spola. I pulled my foot out, but my boot remained in the mud. I had to pull out the boot, put it on, and then repeat this procedure with the second one. To somehow solve the issue of supplying the units with ammunition, the population of many villages came out. They lined up in a chain from village to village, and from morning till late evening passed shells, mines, grenades from hand to hand, often in the rain or even in a snowstorm, sometimes under shelling and bombing. But the main supply was carried out by a transport column, which I led. It included several hundred horses and a large number of wagons. Some of the horses were used as pack transport. The column was located on the outskirts of the town of Spola in the collective farm stables, preserved from the pre-war time. All the riders were also housed here with the horses. A horse requires constant attention. It must be fed, cleaned, mended, harnessed, wagon, and even treated. It is necessary to get fodder somewhere. They gave out some oats, but it was not enough. In general, there were enough worries. I had assistants, including veterinary doctor Lieutenant Shemendiuk. We were accommodated in the nearest hut from the stables. For the first time in 2 years of war, we had a chance to sleep in a warm hut, and even on a bed, without outer clothes and shoes. This ideal did not last long. The Battle of Korsun-Shevchenkovsky was over, and although there was a heavy thaw, our front was in motion. On our part of the front, the offensive began on the night of March 8th to 9th. It was necessary to prevent the enemy from gaining a foothold, burrow into the ground. And although we had little strength and ammunition, we had to not miss the moment, while the enemy was demoralized by the recent defeat. It is very difficult to attack at night, especially in such a slush, but we had to use the element of surprise as much as possible under the circumstances. In addition, the Germans did not like to fight at night, and therefore often accused us that we are not fighting according to the rules. Those who were at the front know that the Germans were pedantic in matters of everyday life. If it was night, then we should rest. If it was time to eat, then there was a break for lunch or breakfast. They called us Asians, because we often caught them in this pedantry: you have to rest or eat, and we attack. Such was the case this time. Our 1st Guards Airborne Division, together with other units of the 53rd Army, went on the offensive. By night attack, the enemy defence was broken through, and in the morning we entered the villages of Skotodevo and Tolmak. Thus began the offensive operation, which was called Uman Batoshanskaya, by the name of the towns that were included in the band of our troops. I remember well a short battle for the village Skotarevo. 2 men sneaked to our meeting from the village. They showed us where the Germans were in the village. Some of their firing points helped us to orient ourselves more accurately. The battalion, with which our battery was operating, moved on the left flank of the regiment, on the left elevated outskirts of the village, and we could clearly see the battle. The village was soon completely cleared of the enemy. There was no time for us to delay. We had to prevent the enemy from breaking away and occupying the defence. After the war in 1980, the Veterans Council of our division organised a meeting in those places. We were in the village of Skotarev, as well as in the villages of Kapitanovka, Tishkovka, Pisarevka, and others. The population met us very warmly. Together we went to the mass graves of our comrades in arms, where exciting morning rallies were held. In the defence of the enemy formed large gaps not occupied by enemy troops. We used this opportunity, developing a non-stop offensive. The weather was good, warm and sunny. For 2 weeks we advanced 120 kilometres. One day we approached a village. It was located down along a small river. The column of our battery began to descend to the village on a slope. Suddenly one of the scouts shouted, "There are German tanks in the village." I looked carefully through binoculars. Indeed, a German tank is moving through the village, and our soldiers who entered the village are scattering from it. I quickly give the command battery to battle. The guns are deployed for direct fire. Gun commanders give commands to fire. Suddenly we see several soldiers running from the village in our direction and desperately waving their hands. It is dangerous to shoot, you can hurt your own. In addition, the enemy tank does not take any action against our battery, although it stands in the open and is clearly visible from the village. Finally, the soldiers ran up and, out of breath, said that we should not shoot, because our soldiers were in the tank and they were riding on it. At first I didn't understand anything, and only later I learned that for some reason the Germans had abandoned a serviceable tank, even filled with fuel. Found skillful people who can control the tank, and our infantrymen decided to ride a little more, and this venture could end sadly. I give the command, "Stand down," and the battery, having withdrawn from the position, is moving forward again in a column. We pass the village, climb the opposite slope. It's getting dark. We have to make a halt for the night. There is a stack of straw nearby, and a deep ravine densely overgrown with thorny thorns. We settle down for the night. The soldiers are hungry, there is no kitchen, it is one for the division, and when it will be it is difficult to say. I call up the commander of the Reconnaissance section, give him money and send him to the village to buy something to eat. An hour and a second passes, and my scouts with the sergeant are still not there. It was getting quite dark when they appeared, accompanying a huge ox with metre-long horns. They found nothing else and took the ox lying in the street. We decided to shoot the ox and boil the meat in cauldrons. I gave a gun to Sotnikov, the commander of the reconnaissance department. The ox was placed on the edge of the ravine. The gun commander, a big Sergeant Dotsenko, holds the cattle by the horns, and Sotnikov aims at the ox in the forehead. A shot was fired, after which the ox swung its horns so much that Dotsenko flew into the ravine. The ox raised its tail and gave a jump from pain. Sotnikov managed to grab his tail and ran after him. He shot the animal in the ass with a pistol in response, a stream of blood and feces in the face and on Sotnikov's clothes. Another shot and again the same result. The ox continues to run as fast as it can in a fever. All this took place in pitch darkness, and it was impossible to see where Sotnikov and the ox were and what was going on there. At last they found the dead animal in the darkness, and not far from it Sotnikov, who was swearing and cursing. If an outsider had seen him at that moment, he would surely have been frightened to death, drenched in blood, smeared with liquid ox feces, covered in straw and mud, the result of a fight with a phlegmatic-looking ox. They laughed, of course, heartily. The soldiers began to skin the ox, to divide it into parts, to put it into pots and buckets, and soon fires were lit and meat smelled. In 2 hours the ox was left with its skin, metre-long horns and hoofs. With difficulty Sotnikov was washed. Then until the end of the war soldiers often joked about it, coaxing Sotnikov to another cattle. To get to Dotsenko had to cut through a ravine in the thorny thorns, and then the sergeant was sent to the sanitary unit. He had no living place on him, all skinned with thorns. As it turned out later, Sotnikov had aimed at the ox in the forehead, but hit him in the lower lip. He, of course, reacted accordingly. Not meeting serious enemy resistance, our troops continued the offensive, with great difficulty overcoming the spring-off road. Mud was sticking with poods on shoes on the wheels of guns and wagons. Horses were exhausted, pulling the cannons out of the mud, and there was no end to it. People, helping the horses, also literally fell from fatigue. But it was necessary to advance, otherwise we would have to break through the enemy's defences later. Having consulted among themselves, they decided to get oxen and harness them to the gun carriages. Soon 4 pairs of oxen were harnessed, 2 pairs in each harness. The oxen made slow but steady progress. However, this depended in no small measure on the weather. If there was a cold headwind with snow, the oxen refused to go forward, and no force could make them move. And since we were moving westward, and the wind was often contrary, we had to either wait for the wind to subside or harness the horses. We learned to literally twist the tails of oxen. They are very stubborn, and if you do not find common ground with them, You will not get far. Sledders are all country people, and they mastered this science of oxen quite quickly. Our ox-drawn battery lagged behind the battalion it was supporting. We don't know where the other batteries and the division headquarters are. We are moving towards the town of Balta. One day, after a tiring transition under cold spring drizzling rain through impenetrable mud, we entered a small Ukrainian village. Hungry, wet, dead tired, we went to the nearest hut to warm up and rest. My scout Kolya Kushenko from Kiev was not particularly shy and immediately asked the hostess for something to eat. The lady promptly replied, "There is nothing. All the Germans have taken it away." Kushenko, "Well, at least give me some water." The hostess again in a hurry, Nimtsi all took away. Kushenko, not thinking long, sets up a bussel in the middle of the house. This is an artillery device for reconnaissance and directing guns to the target when firing from closed positions. It is a large compass with a magnetic arrow, a limb with angelometer divisions, and an optical monocular from above. The device is mounted on a tripod. The hostess stands nearby and watches Kushenko. He has released the magnetic arrow, and it swaying from side to side, one end accidentally points to a cabinet near the wall. Kushenko says to the hostess Bakisha, "The arrow shows that there you have klib lard." The surprised woman replies Tartroki pulls out a kilogram of lard and a loaf of bread from the cupboard. We didn't need to ask twice, we were hungry as wolves. Kushenko went to the bussel again, shook the arrow and said to the hostess, "Now we will see what you have." The hostess hurriedly replied, "That's it. That's it." She climbed into the cellar, took out pickled tomatoes, cucumbers, a pot of boiled potatoes from the stove, a jug of milk from the cupboard. We had a good snack. The hostess sits next to us at the table, propped her cheek with her hand, looking at us with pity. We, in fact, almost all of us were still boys. I had recently turned 20, Kushenko, probably no more than 18. He was picked up by our soldiers somewhere near the Dniester, so he stayed in the battery. The rest of the soldiers were also 19 to 20 years old. Then, when we had already finished everything on the table, the hostess concluded, "I can see why you're beating them. They don't have such equipment." We laughed, thanked the woman, and moved on to Balta. The offensive of our troops continued. Large gaps were formed in the enemy's defence, and our division rushed into one of them, going farther to the west through the enemy rear. The weather was disgusting, strong cold headwind with rain and snow. Our oxen flatly refused to move forward. We barely reached some village. We decided to wait out the bad weather here. We went into one of the huts. The hospitable owners, a grandfather and an old woman, heated the stove well. We dried ourselves and rested a little. Grandfather turned out to be a jolly man. He must have longed for listeners, and continuously amused us with his simple stories from the times of the Civil War, during which he was left without a leg in battle, and various funny stories about the recent occupation. We listened, laughed, joked, and generally relaxed. In the evening, the local youth, mostly girls, began to come to our hut. They shyly huddled in a corner, as if they missed the parties, which were usually held in villages in peacetime. We were all young too, and soon found a common language. We began to sing Ukrainian songs, some music appeared. I think balalaika, dancing began. In general, it turned out to be a merry party. Soon the hut was full of people. Hearing the songs, many adults came here too. The fun continued until late at night. For the first time in the long months and years of the war, we rested our souls, had fun, and the villagers admitted the same. Far past midnight, the young people went home. And in the morning, the whole village came out to see us off. There were a lot of tears, especially among girls and women, and our hearts were clenched whether we will ever have such a fun, rest and sleep in a warm hut. Slowly we move forward. The distance to the city of Balta, 35 kilometers, we overcame only on the third day. We are not only separated from our troops, but also in the absence of any information about the enemy and our troops. We could not hear the usual sounds of the proximity of the front artillery firing, aviation actions, etc. The battery commander, Captain Kulagin, ordered me and my scouts to move forward and reconnoitre the situation in the area of Balta, who was in the city, their own or the enemy. On horseback we went forward, and soon the outskirts of the city appeared ahead, cautiously approaching, camouflaged by bushes and hollows. Not far from the outskirts we stop and carefully with binoculars observe the nearby street and yards. They are of a typical village type. Nothing suspicious can be seen. Somewhere along the street people pass by. Everything is quiet. We go to the nearest hut. The owner of the house looks at us calmly, so there is no danger nearby. We ask around and learn that our units entered the city 5 or 6 days ago. I send a scout towards the battery. Soon our column on Oxen appeared on the road. We chose a place in the houses nearest to the outskirts. One of the locals said that at the station, which is about 4 kilometers away, there were German echelons with food and property. The Germans had no time to take them away. I reported this to the battery commander, and he immediately sent one of the platoon commanders, Lieutenant Poguliev, with wagons to the station. We have no food for either men or horses. Once in a while we manage to get straw, though it is not fodder for horses. The battery is located in the outskirts of the houses. To the city goes a wide straight street, about 3 kilometers long. At the end of it, 2-story brick houses are visible there, obviously the center of the city. In about 3 hours, the first 2 wagons from the station arrived, full of oats, which is very necessary for us. Our horses are already smelling it and neighing. The battery commander gives me the task to go to the city, find someone from the military administration, and find out the situation where our troops, and in particular, our 53rd Army. I asked the scouts to feed oats to my horse first of all. Soon I rode on horseback towards the center of the city. It was almost undestroyed, only some buildings burned. Near the center, near the bridge over a small river, a heavy German Tiger tank lies on its side in the water. Locals say that he was blocking the road to the bridge, and our troops pushed him into the water. Apparently, the German tankers ran out of fuel. The tank has no visible damage. I find out where the military commandant is. It is necessary to drive 200 meters along the central street, which rises on a hill. I turn along this street, and as soon as I started to climb up, my horse stopped and does not want to go. Neither spurs nor whip helps. It stood up and did not move. I get off the saddle and try to drag the horse by the bridle, but nothing works. The horse stands like a halt. Tired, I leaned against a pole near a 2-story house. I can't see any inhabitants. Apparently there is some kind of dining room or restaurant on the 2nd floor, and on the ground floor there are some rooms like storerooms. Soon an elderly man, obviously Jewish, comes up and asks my permission to take some pickled tomatoes from the pantry. I answered him that I didn't know any tomatoes and had nothing to do with them. He quickly went through one of the doors and soon came out with tomatoes in a pot. Soon another came in with the same request. I didn't care about tomatoes. I had to do something about the horse, which continued to stand in the middle of the street unmoving. The street was deserted. No one rode on it, but I had to get to the commandant. One by one the locals frequented the storeroom. I stopped 2 men and asked them to help me move my horse out of the way. The men mounted her from behind, and I pulled her forward by the bridle. The horse took a step with a groan and stopped again. Someone advised to turn it back, under the hill. We turned the horse around, and it went up the hill. I got into the saddle and started to go downhill, expecting to turn into the nearest alley and there try to get to the commandant's office again. As soon as the road began to climb the hill, my horse started again and did not move. I couldn't leave it. They might take it away or it would leave on its own, but I had to go to the commandant. Soon I saw some boy, asked him to hold my horse by the bridle, and I went to the house where the commandant's office was located. There I quickly learned that we had gone to the left and were in the strip of the neighboring army. I had to go back to the battery to report the situation, but my horse still wouldn't move. I tried to ride back down. It went slowly. Without going out into the street, I followed the path behind the vegetable gardens towards the outskirts, where the battery was located. I had not gone 100 meters when the horse lay on the ground. I barely had time to jump off the saddle. I tried to pick it up, nothing worked, and there was no one around. I took off her saddle and bridle and decided to walk to the battery. I took the saddle on my shoulder and moved forward. I walked about 300 meters, looked back. I see some man approaching the horse. I went back. He asked me what had happened to the horse. I told him. It turned out that he was a veterinary paramedic, or rather he used to be. He put his ear to the belly of my Rocinante and asked what he had been fed. I told him that the horses were hungry, and here they brought oats, and they were fed. He explained that the horse was full of oats and might die, and suggested that I join him in rubbing its belly. We started massaging the horse's belly with our fists. She started moaning, raised her head and looked at us. What are we doing? We worked hard with our fists for about 15 to 20 minutes. Suddenly there is a deafening gunshot from the horse's anus. She herself jumped to her feet in fright. My old man says that all the trouble has gone out with the sound. Now the horse will live. Let it rest for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we can go. While we were talking, the horse came to his senses. I put a bridle and saddle on it, thanked the old man for his help, and slowly drove off. The nearest alleyway led to a wide street. The weather was quiet, warm and sunny. It was the middle of March, but it felt like spring, and there was almost no snow to be seen. People came out of the houses, mostly women and children, sitting on benches, basking in the sun. I had to make a good impression and run down the street, because there were no other riders except me. I have spurs on my boots, a sabre on the side, a cavalry saddle. My horse is going down the street quite briskly. When I spurred him on, he obviously didn't expect it, and farted loudly all along the street, shaking his legs. Nearby houses laughed at hearing such blatant music. I pulled my hat over my eyes and galloped forward. The oats were doing their job, and the horse rattled all along the street like a motorcycle, without a muffler. Up to the place where the battery was standing, the music did not stop. The horse was getting rid of the gases accumulated in its stomach, and the whole street was rolling with laughter. Battery witters joked on this occasion our lieutenant gave for the inhabitants of Balta the first concert after the liberation of the city. The next morning our battery moved forward to the city of Kotovsk. Somewhere there is our division. Kotovsk is 40 kilometers away. For 24 hours that we stayed in the town of Balta, the horses had rested and were fed with oats. We left the Oxen and moved forward on horses. We reached Kotovsk the next morning. In the morning there was a small fog that hid most of the town. It was slushy. The ground was covered with muddy snow. The city was quiet. We could see wagons and soldiers of our division. We recognized them by their epaulettes with blue edging. Soon we found out that the division, acting on the enemy rear, suddenly broke into the city, and from the west, not from the east, as the Germans could assume. The battle was of a fleeting nature. The Germans had no time for defense, but to get away. Soon there were two powerful explosions, one after the other, shaking the whole city. The Germans blew up large ammunition depots, located near the railroad not far from the city. The town of Kotovsk was famous for the fact that here in the local mausoleum was buried in the legendary hero of the Civil War, Kotovsky. Soon we caught up with our regiment. The division continued the offensive. Its combat route now lay towards the Dniester in the direction of the town of Dubossary. We moved forward along a wide gully, in the middle of which a small river flows to the Dniester. The enemy offers almost no resistance. Obviously, he is trying to get behind the Dniester, there to organize defense and stop the advance of our troops. We also realize it, and we strive to move forward faster to prevent the enemy from breaking away. Sometimes fierce clashes with enemy rearguards break out in one place or another. We pass the outskirts of the district centre Krasny-Okna. We move forward to Dubossary. Somewhere not far from Dubossary I met my friend, the chief of intelligence of our division, Borya Andreeva Shirtguy, a former street kid, a dashing paratrooper who passed, as they say, fire, water and copper pipes during the landing of the 4th Guards Airborne Corps in the rear of the enemy in January-July 1942. He always wore a paratrooper jacket in winter and a kubanka with a red top, which he wore dashingly on the back of his head, with a chub sticking out from the side. Fedya never got discouraged. He was a master of salty soldier jokes and quips. But he knew his business. And now he had already managed to visit Dubossary, although, judging by the sounds, there was a battle going on there. Fedya had a bucket of red wine in his hands, which he had already managed to buy at the local winery. When he saw me, he began to serve me wine, straight from the bucket. No sooner had I taken a sip than a stream of wine poured over my coat. From top to bottom a red streak was formed. The coat had once been white, but over the winter it had turned dirty yellow, and now I had a red stripe down the front, while the back was riddled with splinters and had been stitched up. I wore this coat until we switched to summer uniforms, but those who saw this stripe on me immediately determined that I had participated in the battle for Dubasari, because not only I had such a stripe, but many who visited this small town. After the war in the 70s, I had the opportunity to visit the meeting of veterans of our division in Dubasari. We were very warmly welcomed there, and of course we were treated with excellent Dubasari wine. In the first days of April 1944, our division came to the Dniester near the village of Iagalik Dubasari district. On the night of April 4th to 5th, the group of brave men crossed to the opposite bank and captured a small bridgehead near the village of Oxen. It should be borne in mind that at that time the Dniester was in flood, the water was raging, and in many places it was out of its banks, and it was risky to cross the river even in the daytime. And here we were crossing at night, and also on the opposite bank, where there was the enemy, who of course was not going to welcome us with bread and salt. In general, the forcing was difficult and dangerous. Suddenness helped. The Germans did not expect that our troops so brazenly forcing the river at this time, when the flood was in full swing. In addition, the enemy tried to destroy or steal everything that was this area suitable for crossing the river, but our paratroopers, with the help of the local population, managed to get a few small light boats, safely hidden from the Germans. In the morning, the enemy discovered our soldiers on the west bank of the river and began furious attacks, trying to destroy our paratroopers. Fierce battles boiled over. Our units, coming to the Dniester, immediately entered the battle. Attempts to force the Dniester in the daytime were unsuccessful. Fierce fire from all kinds of weapons, bombing and assault attacks of the enemy aviation did not give such an opportunity. Only at night it was possible to cross the river in small groups, and that with great difficulty and heavy losses. The bridgehead on the western bank of the river was constantly increasing. We, artillerymen, supported our paratroopers as much as we could, surrounded the captured piece of land with the fire of guns, not allowing the enemy to throw our units into the river. But it was extremely necessary to have observation points on the opposite bank to correct the fire of artillery and to target enemy fire points and manpower, as well as to ensure by fire the forcing of the river by the main forces of the division. I was ordered to take with me a couple of telephonists, a scout and cross to the western bank of the Dniester. At the same time, it was necessary to pull the cable telephone line, having lowered it under water. It was not an easy task. We started to prepare for the crossing. The scouts found a big deck, from which they used to drink cattle, a thick long tree, hollowed out in the middle. But it was very unstable in the water. Moreover, its carrying capacity did not meet our needs. We had to reinforce it. The soldiers found a couple of barrels somewhere, some other wooden constructions, and we had a small raft. We climbed on it, and early in the morning set sail. We rowed with what we could: a piece of board, a shovel, a stake. At the same time, we were pulling the wire of the telephone line. The current was very fast. We were swept up and carried. We were desperately rowing. Among other things, we had to get to a small frontal bridgehead. If we were swept away significantly, we could get to the enemy. The day is overcast, rather strong haze. The opposite shore is almost invisible, and it is to our advantage. The first reel of cable is out. We must quickly connect the second one. The communicator tied up the wires and began to frantically insulate them, otherwise there would be no connection. He bent over, trying to hold the knot in his hands. We're rowing as hard as we can, but the current is very strong, the raft tilted on one side, a jerk of water, and we are rapidly overturned. The icy water covered our heads, but still we all managed to grab the edges of our raft. From the shore we are being watched closely. When they saw that we had overturned, they began to pull the raft to the shore by the wire. When we were preparing for the crossing, we had foreseen the possibility of such a situation, so the wire was led under the bracket, and all the cable reels were attached to the raft. Soon the raft, held by the cable, was nailed to our shore. We climbed out of the water, were picked up under our arms and dragged to the nearest hut. We quickly undressed, Our doctor gave us some alcohol to rub the body and 100 grams of vodka. We drank hot tea and went to the warm stove to warm up. It was the beginning of April, and even a few minutes of a cold font could incapacitate us. But thank God everything ended relatively safely. It could have been worse. We warmed up, dried up, but the task must be solved. Our superiors realized that with such a river as the Dniester, it would not be possible to solve the problem in a rush. Soon pontooners came to the river, and by evening the first raft was launched. Together with other units of the advanced units, we safely crossed the river at nightfall, quickly took up an observation post, and were ready to fire. Our batteries were on the other side of the river. In the morning a fierce battle broke out again. But during the night the main forces of the regiment managed to cross to the bridgehead, and we successfully repelled the enemy's counterattacks. By the end of the day the enemy obviously realized that he could not hold our troops, and he began to withdraw. The first village on the western bank of the Dniester Oxentia is in our hands. For the successful forcing of the Dniester, our division was awarded the Order of Suvorov, and all participants of these battles were announced the gratitude of Supreme Commander-in-Chief Stalin and were given written certificates about it. We continue the offensive towards Kishinev. However, we advanced relatively not far, about 15 kilometers from the Dniester. The resistance of the enemy increased, our fighting orders during March were greatly stretched, our rear supply points lagged behind. We were in dire need of ammunition. In short, there was nothing to fight with, and we switched to defense. In our direction, the front edge passed along the edge of the collective farm garden. Ahead, about 3 kilometers away, on the bank of the small river Roit, a tributary of the Dniester, should be the Moldovan village of Trebuchin. But neither the village nor the river was visible. After the war, during the meeting of veterans of our division in the city of Dubasari, we went to the village of Trebuchin. Only here we realized why we could not see the village. It stood on the bank of a river, and next to it was a high rocky cliff that hid the village. Our battery took up firing positions for direct fire directly in the fighting order of the supported battalion. I chose an observation point to the left of the firing position. Here was a forest, which was a wide strip running perpendicular to the front. On the near edge of the forest I took the observation post. The forest reliably covered the approaches to it, and well camouflaged us from both ground and air observation of the enemy. Other batteries also chose their NPs nearby. The usual work began. We conducted observation in the strip defined to us, finding targets in the enemy's defense, its firing points, lead their mapping, determine the coordinates, put on the tablet. Every day we report to the division headquarters the results of reconnaissance. The terrain in the enemy's defense behind the village of Trebuchin rises up and is well visible from our NP for 3 kilometers. But only what is done in the vicinity of the village, we cannot see, hides the terrain. We can see only the front edge of the enemy, and not everywhere. One morning, watching in the stereo tube, I found a column of Germans on foot, which was coming down the road towards the village of Trebuchin. Apparently, the enemy was approaching replenishment. I quickly reported to the division headquarters, and then oriented the division commander. He quickly found the enemy column. One battery of our Division 122 howitzers stood in a closed position. The terrain was shot in advance. The battery gave a test shot to check the installations. The burst occurred not far from the column, a correction was quickly introduced, and the battery opened a cursory fire on the column. The powerful 122 mm shells destroyed the column in a matter of minutes. We saw well how in fear the Germans were rushing across the field and the nearest bushes, trying to hide from the shelling, but the shells found the target everywhere. The field and the road were strewn with corpses, and those who managed to survive scattered in different directions. The enemy learned a good lesson and no longer dared to move in the open, and I received a commendation from the division commander. The May 1st holiday came. At the front it was no different from the usual everyday life, except that our petty officer Bukov, himself a resident of Moldavia, brought a barrel of wine. Whoever wanted came up, scooped wine with a cauldron and drank it, as they say, for health. Besides, as usual, we were given 100 grams of vodka in the evening. A barrel of wine, which brought Bukov, stood at the edge of the garden under a tree. Borja Andreev, the division's chief of reconnaissance, drank as much wine as he could and spread a trench coat near the barrel and lay down to take a nap in the sun. At that time, the gun commander of our battery, Sergeant Dotsenko, and several men from the gun crews went to the kitchen to get breakfast for the firing platoons. The kitchen usually drove up the forest road and stopped in the woods, close to the observation posts. That's where the firefighters went. They approached the barrel, drank wine. Dotsenko saw that Andreev had a pistol out of his holster, a trophy parabellum. Dotsenko took it in his hands and accidentally pulled the trigger. A shot rang out, the bullet hit Borja Andreev in the back at chest level. Borja was taken unconscious to the hospital, where he died without regaining consciousness. I didn't see all this, I was told. How absurd. Almost 3 years he was at the front, participated in the brutal battles of 1941, parachuted into the rear of the enemy in 1942, fought 6 months behind enemy lines, and then all the time on the front line, and such a tragic accident took him out of life. I felt this loss hard. We were close friends. Often in the same trench we spent our everyday life at the front. Often we slept here, in the trench, under one overcoat, under another. I could not find a place. I hoped that he would survive, but then I learned that he died somewhere in the hospital in the city of Ribnica. The front conditions did not even allow us to see him off. He was a wonderful person. Even in the most difficult situation, he did not lose his head, never got discouraged, no matter how difficult it was. Having no relatives, Borja got acquainted with some girl in absentia by correspondence, and often told me how good she was. He had never even met her, but their correspondence was very warm. He dreamed of going to her after the war and marrying her. He regularly sent her his paycheck. She resented him, but he stubbornly sent monthly remittances. He was a wonderful man. I knew her address and had to tell her the sad news. The fact that he regained consciousness for a few minutes, he asked that Dotsenko not be prosecuted, saying that he did not think he was guilty. His request was subsequently granted, and the tribunal did not consider the case. Soon I was appointed Chief of Intelligence of the division in place of Boris Andreev. The work was familiar to me, so I quickly got involved in it. Almost a month we stood in defense at this line. In June, the division was transferred to another area. The regiment that supported our division occupied the defense on the outskirts of the town of Orgiv, a small and very cozy town of district scale. The population from the town had been evacuated. Only a few men were left to watch for looting from the houses. The battalion with which our division was operating occupied the defense in a fruit orchard on the outskirts of the town, beyond the Roit River. From the city through the bridge the road went to Kishinev. Just after the bridge on the left was a hill on which there was an orchard, obviously a collective farm. On the left was a large swamp, at least 1 kilometre wide and more than 2 kilometres long. Our observation post was in the second trench, which was about 200 metres from the front edge. The trench ran directly through the garden. Through the bumper into it hung branches of vines. Here, on the other side of the trench, there were apricot trees, apple trees and other fruit trees. The trench was dug to full height 1.8 metres. From it we dug a small passage of communication to the cells of the observation post. The communication passage and the cells were blocked. There was also our dugout nearby, where we took turns to rest. We were not badly settled. Besides, it was summer, warm, even stuffy, but we could not go anywhere from the trench. We had neither weekends, nor holidays, nor just free time. The days were divided into work and sleep. All the rest of the time, except for sleep, was taken up by everyday work watching the enemy. Of course, it was tiresome to see the same thing day after day. But war is war. Sometimes there were heavy rains, and then our trench was filled with water to the brim. We, like mice, had to climb out, but the enemy could shoot us at any moment, so we had to lie down across the trench, resting our heads on the berm, and in such a suspended state stay for 2 or 3 hours, until the water went away. Our dugout was lower than the trench and deeper than it, so after every rain it was full of water. We had to sleep in the damp dugout at night. Here, as they say, I learned on my own skin what the expression rot in the trenches means. I got sores all over my body, especially my legs. When I went to our doctor, he said that this disease is called trench rot. In general, we were rotting alive, and no medicine helped, and there was simply no medicine. The only treatment was to undress and sunbathe in the trench when the weather was sunny. The sores dried up and were not as itchy as raw ones. But all summer they made themselves known and then left their traces on my legs for the rest of my life. Every day, from early morning until late evening, and scouts on duty and all night, we do the same in general, tedious work. We conduct surveillance, looking for targets, enemy fire points, spot them, determine the coordinates, report to the regimental headquarters. So reconnaissance is not at all what those who are not skilled in military affairs think of it. Not dashing raids and desperate operations, but patient, sometimes tedious and monotonous work determines the result of reconnaissance. Although, of course, raids and searches have a place in intelligence activities, but they are relatively rare and give limited results. My scouts brought a large mirror from the city, picked it up somewhere in a dilapidated house. The mirror was placed in the trench, where it branches off into 2 observation cells. The trench in this place is blocked, and it seems that it continues further, and who does not know, his forehead hits the mirror. Once the commander of the artillery of our division, Colonel Leonov, arrived at our NP. He always appeared unexpectedly, without warning. And now he entered our trench and quickly went to the observation cells. I had no time to warn him, but he bumped his forehead against the mirror and, surprised, stopped. I tried to apologize, after all. A big boss. But he swore, called us circus performers, and went to the observation cell. The scout, as he should, introduced himself to him, cheerfully answered the commander's questions. I showed him the data on the results of reconnaissance, showed in a stereo tube on the terrain, in the enemy's defense, these targets. In general, the commander was satisfied, thanked for the work and order on the NP, and did not say a word about the mirror. So it stood there until we left this line of defense. The headquarters of our division was located on the bank of the Reut River. There were granite rocks facing the bank, in which there were 2 large caves. Probably they were bunkers for storing wine. They were 3 meters high and 20 meters long. They were where the division headquarters was located. Although not far from the front line, less than 1 kilometer, but a safe haven, especially since the exit was directed towards the opposite side of the front. And it should happen that the chief of communication of the division, Senior Lieutenant Kolya Utkin, was doing something not far from the headquarters. Suddenly a powerful enemy shell burst. When the smoke cleared, Utkin was lying unconscious on the ground. His leg had been torn off by a shell fragment. A single burst, obviously accidental, and such a disaster. I was at the NP and didn't see it, they said later. I didn't even have time to say goodbye to Kolya. We met him only after the war, when there was a meeting of veterans of our division. Since then we kept in constant touch with him. He lived in Leningrad. For the rest of his life he had to walk with a prosthesis. The front was stabilized. The enemy was not very active, neither were we. But it was felt that an offensive was being prepared somewhere. Such a lull usually occurred before the beginning of a major operation. We sharply reduced the limit of ammunition consumption. To carry out an ordinary target shooting, it was necessary to save a week. It was allowed to spend 1 shell per gun in 3 or 4 days. A similar economy was established for the rifle troops. Only for exceptional cases was kept an inviolable reserve of ammunition, which could be spent only with the permission of the High Command. This is a sure sign that an offensive is being prepared. I have already written that our positions were in a large, apparently collective farm garden. Bunches of grapes were hanging directly into the trench, but they were still green and sour. But the apricots were ripe, and when the enemy was firing mortars or artillery, the ripe fruit fell directly into the trench, and we of course enjoyed them. For us Siberians, this fruit was a wonder, but it was dangerous to get out of the trench during the day. At night the scouts sometimes climbed collected crumbled apricots. That was how our everyday life went. Without weekends and holidays, war is war. At the beginning of August 1944, our division received a task to surrender the occupied defense line, secretly, at night to make a march on its own in the northern direction to another section of the front. The route was parallel to the front line of defence, at a distance of 15 to 20 kilometres from the front line. In this connection, strict camouflage measures were envisaged. It was forbidden to use lighting on the march. Even smoking was allowed only in breaks and secretly. It was clear to us, former front-line soldiers, that an offensive was being prepared somewhere and our division, as always, would take part in it. We moved at a fast pace, with the maximum possible speed. With the onset of the day we hid in ravines, gullies, groves. The requirement of strict camouflage was strictly fulfilled. Soon it became known that we would take part in the offensive operation of the Second Ukrainian Front, which later received the name of Korsun-Shevchenkovsky. Within 10 days the division made a 150 10-kilometre march, crossed the Prut River bordering with Romania, and joined the 49th Rifle Corps of the 53rd Army. During the beginning of the offensive, and the breakthrough of the enemy's main line of defence, the division was in reserve of the front, and our 4th Guards Airborne Artillery Regiment took a direct part in the breakthrough of the enemy's defence. I remember well that, to participate in the artillery offensive here, was concentrated so much artillery that there was not enough space for firing positions of batteries. In normal conditions in closed positions the guns of a battery are located at a distance of up to 50 metres from each other, in any case not closer than 25 metres, so that one burst of an enemy shell could not destroy 2 guns at once. Here the guns were placed side by side, almost touching their bases. Long multi-kilometre long rows of guns, followed by 122 howitzers in the same rows at a short distance. Next came rows of 152 howitzers and howitzers, and behind them were positions of larger systems. In the trenches of the first position there was not enough space for the observation points of the batteries, so they had to be placed directly in the passages where there was at least the slightest possibility to see the enemy's defence. At dawn on August 20th, 1944, all trenches and passages were filled with infantry. Soon the artillery preparation began. The morning was sunny, not a cloud in the sky. Suddenly the dawn silence was broken by the roar of a volley of Katyusha rocket launchers. Since the battles of Stalingrad, the artillery preparation always began with a salvo of Katyushas. Their sound could not be confused with anything else, and it served as a kind of command to start artillery preparation, even if the battery's communication with their commanders' observation posts was broken. The deafening roar of hundreds of rocket launchers, thousands of guns literally shook the earth. It shook like an earthquake. The roar was so powerful that standing in the trench we could hardly say anything to each other. We had to literally shout directly into the ear. The rumble of gunshots merged with the rumble of thousands of ruptures in the location of enemy defences. In order not to go deaf, we had to plug our ears. The air was quickly filled with the powder fumes of gunshots and shell bursts, and soon clouds of dust, raised by them in the air, were added. The day turned from sunny and clear to gloomy in a few minutes. The sun could not be seen through the dust and smoke. It was difficult to breathe. Everything was drowned in the infernal rumble, smoke and dust. Observation was out of the question. Everything was hidden in a thick veil. The infernal rumble lasted more than 2 hours. Such was the duration of the artillery preparation of the attack. Here it is appropriate to briefly explain the concept of artillery offensive. This term was developed by our military scientists, entered the army lexicon since the Battle of Stalingrad. Its essence was that before the infantry and tanks began the offensive, artillery should suppress the enemy defence, destroy manpower and firepower, destroy defensive structures, disrupt the enemy's fire system and troop control system. These tasks were solved during the period of artillery preparation of the attack, an integral part of the artillery offensive. The duration of the artillery preparation depended on the nature of the enemy's defence, the availability of its artillery and ammunition. Its duration could be from a few minutes to several hours. In this case, it took more than 2 hours. All guns were firing at maximum rate in order to put the enemy defences out of action more quickly. During the period of artillery preparation, infantry and tanks under cover of the fire of their artillery moved to the attack line, as close as possible to the front edge of the enemy's defence. They then moved to the attack, and the artillery begins the second stage of the artillery offensive, the artillery support of the attack, usually conducted by the method of a firing rampart. The firing ramparts are assigned at a distance of 200 to 250 meters from each other, depending on the nature of the enemy's defense. As the infantry and tanks approach the next berm, the artillery concentrates its efforts on the next berm and fires on it, as long as it takes its troops to cover the distance from one berm to the other. A solid wall of bursting shells moves ahead of his troops from ridge to ridge, usually to the depth of the first position of the enemy's main line of defense. During World War II, this was approximately 1-1.5 kilometers. Then begins the third stage of the artillery offensive, the artillery support of the infantry and tanks offensive in the depth of the enemy defenses, which was carried out to the full depth of the offensive operation. During the period of artillery preparation, usually and aviation struck the enemy's defenses. The artillery offensive required a large amount of artillery and ammunition. They were attracted from other parts of the front, where during this period the offensive was not conducted. In addition, the Red Army had artillery of the Supreme Command. There were artillery divisions and even artillery corps. If the offensive operation was large in terms of forces involved, scope and objectives, then the artillery offensive was usually conducted. It was prepared in advance. It was necessary to bring a huge amount of ammunition, dozens or even hundreds of echelons, to pull together artillery from many areas of different fronts. During the period of the Odyssey-Kishinev operation, the artillery offensive was carried out in the classical variant, that is, as mentioned above. The density of our artillery fire and the duration of the artillery preparation was such that when the smoke and dust cleared a little and our infantry and tanks went forward, the terrain ahead was black and scorched. Everything that could burn had burned or was still burning. When we moved forward, the terrain was black for a depth of about 10 kilometers. The enemy's defenses had been virtually destroyed. Enemy trenches dug at full height had turned into shallow ditches no more than knee-deep. The dugouts were destroyed. Sometimes there were miraculously surviving dugouts, but the enemy soldiers in them were dead, although there were no signs of wounds. Death came from high air pressure after shell bursts and suffocation. Our infantry, meeting no resistance, quickly moved forward. Here, in the fighting order of the forward battalions, were also we platoon commanders of battery control and I with scouts. Attack, always the most tense moment in the offensive. Do not lie down, infantry. Break through the front edge of the enemy's defense. Not stuck at the first position, consider that the offensive has succeeded. Here a very important role is played by the commanders of battery control platoons. They are advancing together with the first chain of infantry, which should come as close as possible to the bursting shells of their batteries, in any case, up to 100 meters from them. Platoon commanders, through their battery commanders, who are still at the NP, signal the transfer of fire to the next line, and the infantry attack the enemy trench without delay, before he has time to get out of the dugouts and start firing on the advancing troops. If you transfer the fire earlier, the enemy will have time to occupy the firing points and fight back. If you delay with the transfer of fire, the infantry can lie down in front of the ruptures, and then it will be difficult to raise it. In addition, the pace of the offensive will be disrupted. In general, the organization of the offensive a complex matter. It is important mutual understanding, interaction, the ability of infantry to act competently on the battlefield. Very important is a good training of artillerymen. Here you need literally jewelry work. From the infantry require that it is as close as possible to the bursting shells of their batteries, and did not break away from them during the firing rampart. If the gunner makes a mistake or the battery commander is a few seconds late with the transfer of fire, the infantry can get under the bursts of their shells, and then it will be very difficult to persuade it to stay close to their bursts. And this gives the enemy the opportunity to organize fire on the advancing. The attack may be thwarted or the infantry may suffer heavy losses. In the episode described, the attack succeeded, the infantry amicably rose and confidently attacked the enemy, whose defenses were reliably suppressed. Rarely were heard a machine gun or machine gun turn of the Germans. Moving forward quickly, the enemy almost no resistance, demoralized and hastily retreating. In the afternoon, when the main line of defense was broken through, the enemy offered almost no resistance. Soon our division was put into action, and it caught up with us. Organized pursuit of the enemy began. We must not give him a chance to gain a foothold on any line.